This video is about methods and functions in C#. I've already created my project. I called it methods, and you can pause here and go ahead and create that project and continue once you have done so. In any strongly typed programming languages, there are predominantly two types of functions or methods. So I'll say functions and methods kind of interchangeably. They are really the same thing. So a function or a method can be void, meaning it doesn't return a value, and it can be value returning. Now I'm going to start with void because it's really easy to explain why you need a void. But before I do that, I'm going to point out that we already have a function to look at as an example. So we have static void main. So I would have said multiple times that we know functions because they take the parenthesis on the end of the word, right? So static void main, that is our first function. Notice its anatomy and also the fact that this one is also void. So if I'm going to be making a void function, I can use main as my template. I won't use the word static. That's kind of a special word for a special situation. So I'll just keep it simple and I will say void print name. So I want my function to be called print name. All right. And then I need the parentheses, and then I need my curly brace body. So if you look at it, the only difference between it and the main is that, well, main has something inside of the parentheses, and it also has a keyword static, but otherwise they're pretty much the same anatomy. Now allow me to explain what each component means. So we start off with our access modifier. So we have static here. That's an example of an access modifier. There are others, but I'm just going to leave it with that. So that's an example of an access modifier. But then we have the return type. So in this case, once again, it is void, and void means that it doesn't need to return anything. So I'm going to explain what I mean when I keep on saying it has to return something or not. So void is our return type, which means nothing. We're not returning anything. Then we have the name. I'm calling it print name. This one is called main, but I can't have another function called main. That's most times illegal. It's allowed under special circumstances, but you have to know exactly what you're doing, and that's called function overloading. But that's a conversation for another time. But it is best to know that they should not have the same name unless it is very, very deliberate. So we have void, the name, and then we have the parameter list. So if there are no parameters to be passed in, then we know that the parentheses remain empty. So in the case of main, it is expecting a parameter of type string, meaning, or a string array, meaning that if I'm going to be calling it and I'm providing values, they have to be of type string and in an array format. So let's continue with our simple void function that says print name. And all I'm going to make this do is do a console.writeLine. Let me just get my spelling right. All right, and we're printing my name, Trevoir Williams. That's all it's going to do. So we have a function called print name, and its sole purpose is to run this line that says print to the console the name Trevoir Williams. So a function can do many operations, just like how we've looked at the for loop and the if statement, and as many lines of code or commands that you give the program in between the curly braces of any body of code, then you can do that many operations. So I could ask it to run a for loop inside of the function. I could ask it to do an if statement. Anything I put inside there, it will do. However, the more important thing after defining it is actually calling it. So this is a definition. So this is a void function definition. And now we need to actually call it. So in the body of the main, I would make the function call. So what happens is that when we click start, the Visual Studio is looking for a function called main. And that's why I would have said do not modify anything in that line or the curly braces. It's looking for this function. If this function is not there, then you don't have a program. Everything gets executed inside of this function. Now, if I tell it the first line is to look for another function, then it will pause, look inside of this class file, and notice I defined the function inside of the class curly braces. So when we get to classes and objects, then you'll appreciate that better. But when defining the function, make sure that it's inside the class called program, and it's not inside main. It's its own function, and it's actually like a sibling of main. It's its own person, right? It's capable of many things, but it just does not have the name main. All right. So when I make a function call, it's going to, well, first the program executes main, and then it sees the function call, and then it searches for a function called whatever name I specified. So I call the function print name. So that means a function call has to be to my function print name. And then I have to open and close the braces to specify that this is a function. Now you see that I have a red line underneath my function, and basically the error message, if you don't know what you're doing, it is of no help. So I did say that we have access modifiers, and static is one of them. Static is not always necessary, but in this situation, because static void main is the main function, and it's not every version of C# that actually has it as static. So that's why I didn't want to bring too much attention to it. But if you do or are using a version of C# that has it as static void main, then it's looking for a function, whatever function you put there, to be of equal access modifier value. All right. So it's going to be saying that it can't find your function print name because it doesn't know the access that it has to it. So I have to append or prepend this with the word static, and then our errors go away. So now our function call is working. We have print name, and the expectation is that when I press start, it's going to start up main, look inside and see that the very first thing you should do is call this function. Then it's going to jump out, look for the function, and you notice when I click the function here, it highlighted the corresponding definition, and then it's going to go to this function and say, what should I do? Then when it's done, it comes back and continues the execution. So I'm just going to put a little console write line underneath the function call to say end function call. All right, so let's try that. All right, so there we go. It went into main, then went to the function call, did what the function told it to do, which was to print whatever value I gave it. And then when it was done, it continued the execution of main until the end. Now that was pretty cool and easy. What if I wanted to allow the users to enter their names, and then I wanted a function that was dedicated to printing the names that were entered? So now I'm going to do that function override thing that I mentioned earlier, where I'm going to have another function that says print name, but then this time it's going to accept what we call parameters, right? So now I'm going into two different concepts. One is function overloading, where I'm just going to duplicate that. All right. And then you'll notice that Visual Studio is now crying because it's saying it already has a function called that. And then this one is crying because it's saying, I don't know which function I'm supposed to be talking to there. I'm seeing multiple references of the same function. Now, to differentiate the two, I'm going to add what I call parameters to the second one that I created. So parameters are variables that they're variables that I'm declaring inside of the function, and I'm allowed to pass values in, and then you can have access to them inside the operation, right? So let me do it slowly and explain everything as I go along. So I did say I wanted to allow the user to be able to enter their name, and then the function is going to print whatever they entered. So that means I'm going to have a function with the same name, print name, but it is expecting to get some value from the user. So for the parameter, if I'm asking you for a name, then I can say string name. All right, so it's a variable. I have to give it the data type and a name, just like how any other variable is defined. All right, and then once I've done that, I can use that variable inside of my function to do anything. So I can just console.writeLine name. So once that function is called and that value is passed in, then I'm just going to print the value, and then it exits the function and then comes back to main. So here's how we're going to call this one now. So remember that when we had print name, we had both of them as print name without parameters. This function call gave an error. So I'm just going to write something quickly to say console.writeLine, enter your name, and then I'm going to define a variable and I'm going to call it n, just some string called n, and I'm going to read the input coming from our user. All right, so this may look like a lot of busy work, but it's fine. We're going to be passing n, so whatever comes in through the console, once the person enters their name and we store it in n, then I'm going to show you how to get it into the function. All right, so a function can be for anything. You can use a function to do anything. I'm using it to do something very simple right now. So I'm actually going to do something differently, right? So that it looks like it makes more sense. So I'm going to print out name in all uppercase. So I'm going to say name dot to upper. All right, so that's another function in our catalog of string manipulation functions where I'm going to pass in the name from the user, and then it's going to print name in uppercase. So to pass it into print name, I'm going to do another function call, and then look at what Visual Studio does when I do the brace. It shows me that I have two versions. So it's saying one of two. You have the version with no parameters, and it says, okay, yeah, that's fine. There is one there like that, so you can leave it alone. But then they also tell me you have another one where it's expecting some string parameter called name. So I can pass in any string value that I want, and that will get stored inside name. Once this function is called, it's passing that value in n into the variable called name, and then I am performing an operation with that value coming in name. That being said, you can have multiple functions. So I just created 2. You can have 10. You can have many. As long as you follow those rules with the names and the parameters, then you should be fine. So if you wanted one that says print name into lower, then I can create another one. And I'm going to say print name lowercase. So print name, and I'm going to call it lowercase. And notice that Visual Studio is going to cause a panic now because I have 2 print names and both of them have only one parameter. So they are identical, right? So like I said, function overloading, you can have the same name, just make sure that the parameter listing is different. So I'm not overloading this one. I'm just going to say print name lowercase. All right. So then it's going to receive some variable called name. And notice I have a variable called name here and a variable called name here, and it's not illegal. Why? Because this name instance is unique to this function, and the same for this one, it's unique to this function. So they don't see each other. These two functions don't really care about each other, right? This one is in its own world, and this one is in its old world, and main is really in its own world. Main is just the one that gets called first, and we have to let main call the others afterwards. All right. So I'm going to just do 2 more function calls here. So I'm going to say enter your name, and then we print back the name, and we're doing that name being printed to uppercase. So I'm going to say end function uppercase name. All right. And then I'm going to call print to lower this time. So I'm going to call print name lowercase, and you see IntelliSense is picking up contextually what's in the file, so it's actually helping me with my custom defined function. And then I'm saying end function lowercase, so we know exactly what is happening along the way. And then we just make sure that we're putting this in lowercase, so name dot to lower, that's how we do lowercase. And then let's check this execution. So for our execution, I notice I left the R off your, but that's fine. So I'm going to say maybe I want something mixed case. So I'm going to say Anthony with a capital TH and ON capital Y, just so that we can see the variations, because we have one that's supposed to do an uppercase and one that's supposed to do lowercase. So the expectation is that everything should be in uppercase at one point and everything should be in lowercase at another point. So the mixed case is removing the bias towards either case. When I press enter, there we go. We have Anthony. So we got to the point where we console that red line, and then it went on to call print name, which it did. and then it did the uppercase, gave us the uppercase Anthony, and then when it was finished, it came back to main, ended, and ran the command after that. Then it went into the next function where it then lowercased it. So we got Anthony lowercase, ended that, and then we went on to end that, and then main. So main was running from top to bottom, like we said, in the sequence of everything. And the only thing that makes it seem like it was stopping and going elsewhere is because of the function calls. So functions are really useful when you have little operations that you want to do that you don't want to put everything inside the main. You can just make a function and write, a nice long, huge block of code elsewhere and then just make reference to it. Also, if there's an operation that you want to do multiple times, you don't want to be writing it. So you see, every time I'm copying and pasting the console.writeLines, right? Now, writeLine is a function, and this function has quite a few lines of code. The C# developers didn't tell you that you have to write the few lines of code every time you want to write print to the console. Instead, they put it in a function, and they told you just call this function whenever you want to access all those lines of code. So that's it for void. I've done 3 simple void functions, but then I'm going to go into value returning, and then I'm going to do some other operations that if we were to repeat them, there are more lines of code that we're going to write in this, and then we'll see exactly how convenient it is when we just have our functions. Now, our value returning functions are very much similar in terms of the anatomy. The only difference really is that they're not void, but they actually have data types. So if you want something to return a string, then you have to define it as a string. And I did say I'm going to explain what I mean by return. So let's get started. I want to write a program that is going to accept 3 numbers from some user and then determine which one of them is the largest. So I'm getting this party started just by writing 3 prompts for N1, 2, and 3 to get 3 numbers from our user. Now, to move forward, I want to call a function that's going to take these 3 numbers and then tell me which one of them is the largest. All right, so I'm going to define a function, and notice I'm doing it outside of main once again. So I have the comment there to guide me, and I'm just going to say int, or well, remember we have to start off with static, and then say int and largest number. That's the name of my function. So access modifier, data type, which is int, not void, but int, because I'm expecting to get a number from the operation. If I was expecting to get a string, then the data type would be string. If I was expecting to get a true or false, the data type would be bool. So based on what you're expecting to get out of your function, that will determine the data type that you use. So let's start over. Access modifier, static. Data type in this situation is int. Our function name is largest number, and then we have our parameter list, and then our curly braces for the body. Now, we're going to see this red line for a while because it's complaining that not all code paths return a value. So I keep on using the word return. What is return? Void functions don't need a return, but we have a keyword inside of our value returning functions that says return. So we have to have that value return. So I'm just going to leave return 0 there just to get rid of the red line for now. So you can do that, get rid of the red line and leave it alone, but that will have to change eventually. Now, I did say that we were building this function to take the 3 numbers. So if I'm getting the input from my main function and I want my function that is not main, which is largest number, to know about these 3 numbers, then I'm going to have to define parameters for each number. So I'm going to have to say int, and I can call them n1 or I can call them num1. So I don't have to retain the same name. So you notice that we got a variable, we got the value into the variable n, but then we called it name in our functions, right? Because this is generic. Because regardless of the name of the variable, when we make the function call, we're really just passing in the value. So this could have been a static string, or it could be any string variable that we call, but our function will just represent that value in the variable called name or whatever we call the parameter. So once again, it doesn't matter what we call the parameter variables as long as we make sure that we pass in the correct values. All right. So I'm going to say int num1 and int num2 and int num3. All right. So we have three numbers that we're passing in. And then we're going to use an if statement. So like I said, we can do any operation inside of a function. So this function is going to be a bit more complicated than the void ones that we've done. But that being said, it's not because one is void and one is value return why one is more complicated than the other. You can do any number of operations inside of the function as you need to. Now let's write the code for this function. So I'm firstly going to define my largest as my num1. So I'm saying int largest is equal to num1. That's just a wild assumption. I don't really know if it's my largest. I just want something to represent the largest number. And then now that I'm assuming that it is the largest, I'm just going to compare to see if num2 is greater than it and if num3 is greater than it. So I'm going to say something like if num2 is greater than largest, then my new largest value, as far as I know, is num2. So I'm going to assign that value into largest. So now I've done one comparison. I've already assumed num1 is largest, and then I'm going to compare it and num2. And if num2 turns out to have a greater value than the current largest, then num2 is my new largest value. Now I need to compare largest with num3. So the reason I'm doing it like that is if this evaluates the true, then I need a way to compare the value that's in num2 with the value that's in num3. And the value of num2 would now be the largest. So I need to say if num3 is greater than largest, then the new largest is num3. You see that? So let's start over. I'm setting the largest value as num1 to begin with. Then I'm going to say if num2 is greater than largest, meaning num2 is greater than the value that's in num1, then it is my new largest. Well, largest is always my big comparison. So if this doesn't evaluate to true, then largest is still num1. Then I'm going to compare whatever value is in largest, which at the time is num1, with the value that's in num3. If num3 turns out to be greater than largest, then the largest is now num3. If both of these fail, then largest was num1 from the beginning. So now that we have done all of this operation and we know the largest, now we need to return that value after the function has done its operation. And then that's where that return keyword and operation comes in. So we have to say return, and then we're returning largest. So the return data type has to match the data type of the function. So I can't be returning full name here. I can't be returning a string. Let's see what happens if I put a string there. Return hello. Then that's just an error because it's saying I cannot implicitly convert string to int because I'm expecting a return type of integer, but you're giving me a string. So I have to return the data type that is used to define the function. So I'm returning largest. So largest, whatever comes out of this operation, I'm returning that value. Now, in terms of the function call, we need a way to get that value from the function. So remember that void doesn't return anything. So we can just do a function call at any point. I would just make the function call and leave it there. But then when it's a value returning, because it's sending back a value, I need to be able to capture or store that value, however you want to think about it. So I'm going to have another local variable. I'm going to call it result. And the contents of result will be whatever is returned from this function call. So I'm just going to make the function call largest number. And then I'm passing in, remember, I'm expecting to pass or expected to pass in num1, num2, and num3. So I'm passing in n1, n2, and n3. All right. And then semicolon. So let's look at this execution one more time. I get the 3 numbers from my user, and then I'm saying I want the content of this variable called result to be the result that is returned when I call my function largest number and pass in all of those numbers. So when it calls largest number, it gets the 3 numbers, num1, num2, num3. It does its operation. At the end of the operation, we're sending back the value that is as a result of this operation. And once again, once it's sent back, it is now stored inside result. So if I wanted to print to the screen the largest value, then I would have to say console.writeLine largest number colon result. All right. And I'm using interpolation here. So once again, that is how that will work. So I'm just going to execute, and it's going to hit the main function, and the main function still does the print name and the print name n and the lowercase and everything, and then it will go to the prompts. All right, so I'm executing main again, and it's prompting first for the name. So I'm just going to give it the name test. Let it go by that. So you see, it did test it, uppercase it, and it lowercase it. That's fine. But then I want my numbers. So it hit all of those. Now it's at the prompt. First number is 1. Second number is 5. And third number is 10. And we see largest number 10. Why? Because it hit the function call, did its operation, and then returned the largest, which we then stored in result, and then we printed back to screen. So that's a quick introduction to methods and functions in C#. As you go along and we hit object-oriented programming more, you're going to realize that functions are at the basis of this language and any other object-oriented language.